Hello everyone. So in the last video we talked about Anaximander's achievements, and then we talked about his momentous achievement, which was, as we said, the notion of the non-perceptible sort of substance underlying everything. And in this video we'll talk about this, and then a bit of his philosophy and his idea of how the world is formed and what it is constituted by. So as we said, he rejected the idea that the elemental masses visible in the world, what we have, water, air, fire, earth, like just one of them could serve as the basis for everything. And instead, what he did was he pointed to an unnamed substance. He doesn't name it. Apeiron is a description rather than a name, right? Which basically just means, the unbound, without boundary, aperas, as we discussed, without limits. And he pointed at that substance, and he said that this underlies things, and this substance, is what everything comes from and what everything sort of goes to, and what is the basis of the whole world. So what he's then doing is that he's bringing in a substance which is less definitive in character than any one particular element, and making it the basis of everything. And as I said, this shows or demonstrates a distinct abstractness of thought. It's going towards a more abstract philosophical way of thinking. Even further, I would say, than Thales and his water, where he is abstracting, but there is also a certain degree of, immediate tangibleness of the matter that he wants to talk about sort of coming in. Because, well, as you know, that earth, water, fire, even though if you talk about them generally, they seem very sort of abstract, but they are sensible, in the sense that you can sense them, they are manifest, they are there, they are present. And the idea that, the universe must be made of something more ultimate than them, more primitive than them, something prior to them, right? So if, let's say, if we say water is the arche, water is the beginning, then and then we say that, but water came from something else. What did water come from? If somebody asks, then you would go in this series. Arche. That's why arche is also important, because, and this Aristotle talks about in his Metaphysics, that you don't want to have this infinite regress. You want a primary, a primary principle. A primary principle, and that doesn't need to be material. Well, with the natural philosophers that we're talking about, it is material. Even Apeiron, even though it's not very distinct, it is still material. We think of it as something material. So the idea that if we have a primary matter, a primary material, then we don't say, okay, where did that come from? If it is Apeiron, especially if it is Apeiron, think about it, it has no beginning, no end. It gives us a perfect material. I think Aristotle pointed it out, that Apeiron is a very good sort of answer to, what did everything come from? Everything came from this one, slightly vague, slightly indistinct, substance which underlies everything. But, it is Apeiron, it is without limits. It does not have beginning, it does not have end, it does not, even if you think about it temporally or spatially, and we'll discuss, which of these meanings could apply to Apeiron, and maybe more than one. The idea that it could be something that is boundaryless, and something that is boundaryless and boundless and limitless could be the beginning. You think of it as, if it is the beginning, it's also the end, it's also the middle, it's everlasting. So if you start bringing in the idea of the everlasting, then that means that you don't need to think of, okay, what is the origin of the everlasting? The everlasting is the origin of the everlasting, it goes in a circle. Yeah? So everything else then that comes from the everlasting, though, becomes, a secondary manifestation, a secondary phenomena, which could either be a secondary phenomena that, arises from it completely, or it could just be a modification of that primary sort of matter. And we'll see, which one holds true for Anaximander. And this modification, it could be obtained, or secondary manifestation could be obtained by a process of separating out, which we'll talk about. So what else do we have in Anaximander? We have the notion of primary opposites. Right? So he doesn't talk about fire, air, water, or earth. Rather, he talks about the hot, the cold, the wet, and the dry. Right? So it's more of the notion. So the Apeiron, boundless, contains all of this, right? The Apeiron contains the hot, the cold, the wet, the dry. These are substantive things, right? But they're not exactly, so when you say cold, what is cold? Is it air? Is it water? Is it earth? What is wet? Is it water? Is it earth? Is it air, mist? What is dry? Is it earth? Is it fire? It's like not exactly, when you talk about these primary opposites, you can't really immediately put an element that, would go with it directly. So the hot is probably fire and nothing else, but it could be something else, who knows? But the cold, the wet, the dry, the notion of primary opposites, take it as basically these four notions of hot, cold, wet, dry. Then what you have is, you have a conflict of opposites, yeah, with, and we'll go into details of that. So for example, fire versus water, what does fire do to water? It evaporates it. What does water do to fire? It sort of puts it out, right? So you have this conflict of elements. You have a conflict between these four sort of elements, the hot, the cold, the wet, and the dry, and their manifestations as fire, air, water, earth, or whatever. And why one of them is not primary is because if one of them were unlimited and the others weren't, the others would have perished, right? This is one of Aristotle's explanations, that, imagine if water was, unlimited, then it would have put out all fire, there would be no fire. Or if fire was unlimited, it would have evaporated all water. So that means that, there is an unlimited that underlies them, but they themselves are in conflict and they're part of the unlimited. We don't know how much there are. Obviously, there's unlimited of it, but there's an equal. There's an equality, let's say, of these four elements. There is some kind of an isonomy of, like, there are equal in law. By law, by rule. And what is the law? The law is that, none of them perish. They are imperishable. Apeiron in that sense is an arche, it is imperishable, it's unborn, it's unlimited. They fight against each other. Now, let me see if I can read out this section from Theophrastus, where he gives an account of Anaximander's originative substance. So, there are three accounts in your book, so you can read all three of them. I'll read one of them. Or I'll read a mix of them, let's say. Yeah? Of those who say that it is one, moving, and infinite, Anaximander, son of Praxiades, a Milesian, and the successor and pupil of Thales, all this, said that the principle and element of existing things was the Apeiron, which we talked about right now, and we'll continue to talk about, being the first to introduce the name of the material principle. He says that it is, or rather, a material principle. In addition to, and this first one was from Simplicius and the second is from Hippolytus. In addition to this, he said that motion was eternal, in which it results that the heavens come into being, and we'll talk about motion as well. He said that it is neither water nor any other of the so-called elements, but some other Apeiron nature, from which come into being all the heavens and worlds in them, right? So not one of the elements. This nature is eternal and unaging, and it also surrounds all the worlds, right? Eternal, unaging thing. And the source of coming to be for existing things is that into which destruction too happens according to necessity. For they pay the penalty and the retribution to each other for the injustice according to the assessment of time. He talks of time, as he describes it in rather poetical terms. So, see, even though he wrote prose, the idea is that poetical terms, why poetical? So, what he means out here, I think this is Simplicius, that, it's not very clearly rational. What does he mean, retribution? As I said, law itself is understood as, a law of retribution and action. That's not how we think of laws of physics these days, right? That, one element is waiting, I'll take retribution. You rain too much on my fire, I will evaporate you. That's not the kind of way we understand physics these days. It'd be fun though if we did that. So this is the sort of description that we have of Anaximander, and let me read out the one fragment, his one extant fragment. It's pretty interesting, and it's great to have an extant fragment, though we don't know which part exactly, how much of it is exactly Anaximander. But yeah, let me read it out. Some other Apeiron nature from which come into being all the heavens and the worlds in them. And the source of coming to be for existing things is that into which destruction too happens, according to necessity. For they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. As he describes it in these rather poetical terms. So, the end of the other fragment and this sort of section, which we assume is Anaximander's own words, which, traveled through time up to now, which is pretty impressive, I would say. The idea of retribution. So let me repeat the sort of very important bit from that fragment. They, what is they? We have to figure out. Make just recompense to one another for their injustice according to the ordinance or assessment in some translations of time, right? So if we assume that the they is those primary opposites, the hot, the cold, the wet, and the dry, what are they actually doing? So there is an injustice that is being done. We talked about it. There's Adity. There is some kind of an injustice that was being done. So let's say the water put out the fire, or the fire evaporated the water. And this injustice requires recompense. So the Greek world had this very strong idea of retribution. An injustice is done to me, I need recompense for it. I need to be given recompense, or I should extract this recompense. And unlike modern law courts, where we most of the time go to the law court together and expect the state to take recompense, and even then you had that, and especially in Athens, later you had an idea of a law court, but there was also a question of personal justice. Like there's one which is a state justice, but there's also personal justice, and personal justice was often extracted personally. Somebody did me an injustice, I will take recompense. So here, with the Apeiron and the four elements, the four sort of opposites that are coming out of it, they don't go to a law court. They seek recompense according to what they believe is injustice done to them, right? So let's say that water, did injustice to fire, or fire did injustice to water, then water will need to nourish fire through, and how does water nourish fire? So the idea was that water nourishes fire through evaporation, right? The water evaporates, becomes air. That air, and remember that air to aether, it travels upwards and becomes the fire, the sun. There is some kind of a cycle, a natural cycle that's going on. And it's a personalized sort of element to it, in the sense that there is a cycle of retributive justice, of recompense that's taking place out here. So the balance of elements in that sense is being constantly redressed. One element, one opposite, encroaches upon another, and then it is followed by a retribution in which the other regains lost ground. So we could think of, so fire cools down into cloud, which is air, which then turns into water, which then becomes moisture on earth, right? And then you have this alternating of seasons, the alternation of hot and dry and cold and wet. So that alternation also is a kind of balance and retribution. And that's why he needs the notion of an Apeiron, right? That's why he needs a notion of something that is unlimited, which underlies all of them, because no one of them is the master, right? No one of them is all-powerful. And because in the first place, if it was all water, then fire would not even have come into being, is what Anaximander's sort of theory implies. And because for water, even if we think of water as transforming into fire, the action of fire as theory of evaporation needs to already exist, So if I say that, water is nourishing fire through evaporation and it's becoming fire, but then the fire is what is evaporating the water, that water doesn't automatically nourish. There is an action by the fire on the water. There's this retribution, this redressal of balance. Why would it act, So the idea is it would act only if it feels like some injustice was done and it wants retribution, right? So the other sort of quote that we have, that we got from Theophrastus Simplicus, was that things perish into those things out of which they have their being according to necessity, right? So there is an idea that there is a mutual transformation of different elements, one into the other, right? In a sort of present order as well. So we were talking earlier about the original sort of birth of fire, birth of water, so that was the Apeiron separating out, with this conflict of opposites, Polemos, the father of all and king of all that Heidegger makes so much of, that Polemos, that means war, right? So Martin Heidegger, who also was very interested in the Greek, so he made much of this one Heraclitean fragment. We'll get to that later, where he says Polemos is the father of all and king of all. But you see that in Anaximander already, where you have, it is a kind of war, it's a struggle of opposites, all equal. Think of it as four chiefs, all trying to regain ground over the other, but all of them coming from the same one element, right? And then perishing. But when they perish, they perish into those things out of which, they perish into the Apeiron, let's say, and then more comes out, right? Because they are all infinite. Apeiron is infinite, right? And which means that there is an unlimited supply of the four elements, yeah? So even if, and I think in Anaximander, there was an idea of the earth has coming out from the drying out of the ocean, right? So and this notion sort of exists in like a lot of, ancient thought, is that, it was all water, all ocean, which, through the action of the sun, which is fire or hot, evaporates this ocean, and from that ocean, the earth emerges. So there is an idea of the formation of the cosmos and the cosmology and cosmogony, and we'll talk about cosmogony as well, where you have new elements coming out and something else dissolving into the Apeiron, but there is always going to be a redressal and a balance, right? There is going to be a redressal in which things would come out of, an older order and then perish into a new order and then come out of another order. And in fact, if you want to then link it to the earlier cosmogonies, so even in like in Homer, you have the fall of Troy, some kind of a eugenics project by Zeus, who knows, and the old order in some ways dying, a new coming up. In fact, even before that, like or let's skip that. But if you go to the description of Okeanos, of Hesiod, where you have from the first gap was produced, and you have Gaia and Uranos and things separating out, and then Kronos taking over, and then Zeus taking over. So there's a constant sort of new order retribution. Although in Hesiod it goes and fixes at Zeus, but there is this idea of the twilight of the gods, bringing some Nietzsche in out here. So you have this idea of the Götterdämmerung, the sort of the fall of the gods. So to summarize, it is a natural tendency of each of the elements in some ways to swallow up its opposite, right? So fire would swallow up water. We could think of it as, a simple war, polemos, as we mentioned, a war between elements or between opposites. Or we could also see it as a conversion of one to the other through an intermediate stage, and that would be more so the case with Anaximenes, whom we'd, come to next. But what is clear, at least in Anaximander, is that there's no complete and final victory of one element. It's like, unlike Zeus, who has a final victory and swallows up Metis, and, then there is no sort of, there's no challenge to his reign. Here, there is no complete and final victory of one element, and the balance between the four elements is being constantly restored, constantly maintained. One of them is taking over the other, and the other one is taking sort of retribution later whenever they can. And even if locally there is one gains advantage, so let's say Earth is one of the examples of this local advantage where fire is evaporating out the water, and then Earth is coming out. So there is a local advantage, but there would be the other would be encroaching somewhere else. Let's say water then is encroaching somewhere else, maybe causing flood somewhere else, who knows. So that's why there is this assumption that this diversity must have evolved from something which is radically simple, something that comes before all of these. So as we talked about it already, the arche, which is for Anaximander, the Apeiron, which is boundless, which is unlimited, and which is in the process of emergence in this world, the separating out, this polemos, this war, the struggle that we are talking about. This process, is something that is then bringing, it's sort of the phenomena that we see around us, the appearances that we see around us, is something that is emerging from this Apeiron, and through the action of the different elements that you find in the Apeiron upon each other. So in the next video, I will go more in depth into what we understand by the Apeiron and the unlimited. And yeah, thank you.